So I'm interested about financial capital, for example, because it seems to me, and I'm not quite sure about Canada, but in Australia there seems to be a trend developing that people could think they can buy programs to fix problems.
Yeah.
Okay, so governments tend to say, well, we'll put some money into this program without looking at the underlying cause of what the problem is. For example, social deprivation or disadvantage or whatever it happens to be. That it seems to me that money may not be the thing that we really should be focusing on. The government should maybe focus on different forms of capital building.
Yeah. The money doesn't. It has a long history, I guess I'll say, of most of us, like Andy, myself, Doug Reeves, Rick Dufour, Ben Levin, all of us that work in this area, say it's not program, it's practice. So don't think you can buy a program that will make a solution. You've got to change your practice. That's where you need to focus. So if and people do try still to buy programs, technology is another wrong driver per se. It's useful, and I'm advocating it a lot more myself. But it's not very useful if you put money into and buy a bunch of computers and software. It just is wasted money. So that's why investing in social, if you just take the word resource instead of capital, just resource, there are human resources and there are material resources. So social capital is obviously a human resource, and that's what you want to see develop is the sheer extent of social capital. And I want to say two big things about this. One is that finding about if you get a good teacher 3 years in a row, what people miss is in the high quality systems, and I'm going to say Finland, Singapore, and Canada. In the high quality systems, the actual difference is you're likely to get a good teacher 3 years in a row, right? Because the profession as a whole is that strong, and that's the variable is the sheer probability that you will get a good teacher, not whether or not a good teacher is key. And so once you say it that way, you realize you have to build up the whole profession. And the second big point I want to make is that we do make in the book is if you really want to build up the whole profession, you have to use the group to develop the group.
Okay.
We'll talk. I want to talk about human and social capital and the flow there in a minute. But if you just take the notion, use the group to develop the group, then you've got the right viewpoint, I'd say.
Okay, so because I'm interested in that concept of good and bad teachers as opposed to continuous improvement of all teachers.
Yeah.
So you see social capital as being a key to that, the improvement of the quality of teaching practice right across the system?
Yeah, I mean, if you stand back from it, as I just did a minute ago, you really want to see the entire teaching profession get better. That's what you want to see. And then we say, well, how do you make the teaching profession get better quickly? Use the group. And the big example, I'm sure there are differences in culture, obviously, but if you take Shanghai, a city of about 22 million, 23 million people, they came from almost nowhere 4 or 5 years ago to the top performing in reading in the world. And they're actually quite a bit above Finland and Singapore, which were the top. And you could say, well, how could they do that in such a short period of time? And basically what they did was they took schools that knew something about this, and they matched them to schools that didn't know much, and they gave money for that learning partnership to flourish. And they did it without attitude. A big thing we have is non-judgmentalism. And so that's a big example in one way, but I would say in Ontario, we started to get results in about 12 months, certainly in the second year, and we have mostly good results every year. Sometimes it kind of got stuck and then it moved up again. And we moved this quickly in 2 or 3 years, but now it's 8 years, because we used the group to develop the group. Our strategies invested in the development of social capital, and we need to talk more about what that constitutes. Yeah.
Okay. I'll just quickly go to Finland if I can for a minute, because the schools I visited there aren't high levels of collaborative practice in Finnish schools, or I didn't see any evidence of high levels of collaborative practice. High levels of intellectual capital, investment in teacher training and professional practice, and high levels of trust in the system, but little collaborative practice. Is that how you see it there as well?
Yeah, I was there about 18 months ago, and I'm going to do a tour there next year. And they early on, when they did get their success, and people started to notice them, there was more discussion of it. Some of the leaders that I talked to who were there said, we're worried because we're number one, it seems, but we don't know how we got there. What was our strategy? And so everybody started to kind of scratch their heads about that. And then when I went over, I basically said to them, you haven't taken advantage of your intellectual human capital as much as you should have. And if you did that through collaboration, you get a next wave of success. Whether or not they do that is up to them, but you're quite right that there are not impressive collaboration going on in Finland. They just have good teacher after good teacher.
They do.
And if they ever kind of took advantage of that resource with a strategy of social capital or collaborative learning, they would just get a bump up.
Okay. So I'm interested in some of the networking that's going on in Ontario between schools and principals' networks working together to share responsibility for student learning outcomes across school communities, rather than the competitive nature, which when I was in the UK, they seem to be moving to a highly competitive environment in the UK, which is anti-collaborative and anti-cooperative and anti-capacity building, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why they do so poorly in the international test. And, at least they've done, and I'm going there next week in 4 or 5 cities, but at least what they've done is required now federations and academies, in other words, multiple schools in England. They're still isolated within the federation, but at least they have a bump up in social capital, so to speak, because they're using clusters. But in Ontario, I mean, the building blocks here are, building block 1 is inside the school, professional learning communities, and this is the principal is key
within
here.
Schools.
Within a school, intra-school collaborative cultures, let's say. And the principal is key, and that comes out really clearly in Vivienne Robinson's research on the principalship, where she says the key factor from her findings, the meta finding, the key factor that's twice as important in its effect size, 0.84 to 0.40, and the other factors, is the degree to which the principal participates as a learner in working with teachers to improve the school. So the first, I mean, I'm not saying we just do this in a linear fashion, but the first thing to recognize is we need school principals whose main role is to build social or professional capital. That's the main role of the principal. By that I mean in a focused way on improving instruction or pedagogy, linked to student achievement, and building the capacity of teachers to do that, and the capacity of other leaders in the school to help lead, so the leadership team and the leader of leaders. So that's one thing. But once you start doing that and you say, well, we are interested in whole system reform, and it's going to take forever to have 5,000 schools change, so we better use some leverage of schools working with each other. So the next one is the network of schools. So many of the districts we know and work with that are successful have their schools in networks of X number of schools. So, and we do quite a bit of filming now. Every time we see not every time, but when we want to see whole districts, whether it's 15 schools or 200 schools, a whole district being successful, and then we want to capture how they became successful by filming a few schools and the district strategy. So I just take 2 that are different in size dramatically. Sanger, which is a district in California, has about 15 schools. It's in near Fresno, and huge numbers of Hispanic immigrants in the last 8 years, and they are enormously successful. And I won't be able to. I won't want to describe all the reasons why, but one of the pieces they have is every one of their 15 schools is in a network of 3 or 4 other schools. Okay. And that network of 3 or 4 are working. They meet in a different school 4 times a year. The different school is the host. The school leaders are leadership teams are learning from each other. If I'm in one of those schools and I have let's say my grade 3s are not, the math is not very strong, and yet one of the other schools has a very strong grade 3 math program, then we work out a series of visitations, cross visitations for those teachers. They learn from each other. So there's that network of 4, in that case, very powerful. Glue, I'm going to call it the social glue. Okay. That's the professional glue, really, also. And then in York Region, elementary schools are all in networks of 6. And so the networks are always focused. So a network in a given year, if you go to York Region, you find any given network, they say, we're focusing on mathematics this year. And we're getting all of the focus, the use of data, the best practices, so linking with our consultants, what's going on with the Literacy and Numeracy Secretariat. So they do that as well. And then we have whole districts are learning from each other because they're fostering that kind of linkage. York Region has 200 schools almost, and that's a learning community as a whole, with their learning fairs that they have at the end of the year, where there's everybody's exchanging, and it just, the information is flowing laterally and vertically in those systems.
So do you have a view about how big networks can be before they become ineffective?
Not a fixed view. Singapore, every one of its schools in its network, I think it's could be 15 or more schools, maybe even 20. I'm not sure, but anyway, it's a larger number that I'm talking about. And what they do is they have a system of when teachers enter the profession, year one, they can enter one of three streams. They can become a teacher leader, career path. They can be administrative principal leader, career path, or they can become a system leader, which is curriculum consultant and so forth. So it might make a long story short. These networks in Singapore are led by a network director, a leader, and that they don't appear to be too big because they have, first of all, they have a lot of skilled school principals, a lot of skilled teachers, and the higher the capacity, the more you can purposely draw on peers. They with the McKinsey finding, the higher performing systems, the top 5 or 6 of their 20, they said once capacity is at a certain level, peers drive innovation. So leaders have to help peers drive innovation.
Okay. So I'm interested in the volunteerism or the buy-in to these networks, about how important that is, whether you can force people into networks and build social capital, or whether there has to be an element of wanting to do it. And also some of the things in the UK, for example, where some of these networks are appointing executive principals to manage groups of schools.
So we'll come back to the executive leader a little bit later, but on the question of forcing people or getting them in these networks, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. And so the way we expressed it in Professional Capital book is it's a combination, a judicious combination of push, pull, and nudge. And so push is when you are actually pushy and you're getting people who are reluctant to come in there. Pull is when the process is so attractive that people find themselves drawn into the vision and the process. And the nudge is you shape it in a way where it's hard to avoid. I saw this very nicely we did filming in Australia in ACT in Canberra last November. And we're just editing now the stories, and I just said this morning, went over this one again. Canberra High School, which is and so it's a regular high school. They introduced a quality teaching framework. That's a popular framework. I think actually comes from Queensland.
It does.
Yeah. So some teachers got interested in that. Principals supported it. They started to get volunteers. So they began then and they trained people to be able to observe, give feedback, and it grew. And this we started in in ACT 3 years ago with the new Jim Waterston, his name is. And we were an advisor to him because he wanted to change the system. And so I'll divert a little bit by saying he had about 81 schools, fairly stagnant system. He created 4 networks of 20 schools and with network leaders. And that's part of our advice, although structural isn't the only point. Obviously, I have to do something within the structure. So these networks were pretty much successful, and the clusters in that. And so we saw this example inside the school go from almost nothing to almost full-scale interaction of all teachers participating. And I said to the principal and the deputy and the teacher leader, I said, is it mandatory or voluntary? And they said, they were a little bit kind of struck by the comment, but I love the way the principal finally said it. He said, well, it is voluntary, but it's inevitable, he said.
That they'll join.
Yeah, because so what you get in these systems is that the pressure of which is a pull factor and a push factor. It's both pressure and support. The pressure of doing it when the peers start to value it. It's one thing for the principal to value it, but if peers start to value it, you can't escape it, really. And so it does. The ownership then comes as a result. And in a change sense, people end up, we call it realization. Many teachers end up owning it when at the beginning they didn't like it, or before they tried it, they didn't want to do it. But they ended up changing their mind as a result of the experience. Because what happens in those, we call it the motion, leadership, ready, fire, aim. What happens in that is people develop skills, capacity, they develop clarity, and they develop ownership, and all of those things are shared among the group, and then it's institutionalized.
Okay.
It's hard to remove at that stage.
So as we've been trying to form some networks in my state, in Australia, I suppose there are two pressures on these networks. Some people would like networks to be of like schools, for example.
Yeah.
And other people say you're better off with a network of disparate schools because maybe they can add more capacity to each other if they are different. I'm just interested about what you think about that.
Well, if we take the province-wide strategy we've had here for the last 8 years that Literacy and Numeracy Secretariat has orchestrated, they've done both. They have they've said we want schools to networks to occur in any case. And then they've had a schools on the move strategy where they've said, okay, let's identify those schools that are on the move, capture what they're doing just in a profile, a couple of pages, and then make it easy for other schools to learn from them.
Okay.
And so what I think is this. One is probably the network should be disparate. If by disparate, I mean it's geographical, like 6 schools. So they may be similar or not, but the important point is there's proximity.
The geographical,
yeah, the geographical. So they can be that. The other thing we've had great success with is we call it statistical neighbors, and the label really tells you where I'm heading on this. We have all of our schools, the elementary schools, for example, in four statistical bands from Stats Canada. Band 1 is more poverty, and band 2 and 3 and 4 is less poverty. And so what we want principals to think the following way. Compare yourself with yourself, your school. So regardless of what anybody else is doing, are you getting anywhere from where you were last year or 2 years ago? Self to self. Secondly, compare yourself to other schools that are similar to yours, apples to apples. So that means who's other schools that are your statistical neighbors, to use that language. Who's doing better than you are, and what are they doing, and how can you learn from that? And then thirdly, we want people to compare themselves to the absolute standard, that close to 100%, and therefore you get anything goes by the time you get to that. So it's a mixture of these comparisons, and I do think the schools have to be similar enough. They have to have, for example, ability to focus on the same domain, like math or arts or whatever it is. So I think there has to be that similarity.
So let's talk about the domains. So you think it's a good idea to have a narrow focus for a short period of time, or to have multiple focuses for a longer period of time, if I'm making sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. We have said very clearly, and in all of the things we've written about, I'm talking about Ben Levin as well, has written done this work with us. And all of the things I'm talking about, incidentally, are things that we've done. So it's not like abstract theory or research. And so I think it's we've said one of the first things that you have to understand is focus. So if I mentioned Doug Reeves before. If you go, he did a book last year called Finding Your Focus. And his first chapter was the law of innovative fatigue, which is too many innovations. So too many innovations tire you out. Too many usually means they come and they go, so you don't really get settled on one. And too many is they're too complex for you to get good at any of them, so people really, they don't have a kind of a leverage to do that. So we prefer a small number of ambitious goals. But those goals don't have to be narrow. So when we did literacy and numeracy, as we do, we've defined them actually pretty broadly in 2 ways. One is they include the higher order skills. They're just not bubble test stuff, so problem solving and thinking and critical expression. So that's the higher order skills that makes them deeper. And then we also want to link them to other parts of the curriculum, math and drama and arts and literacy across the curriculum. And that's what I would say we've evolved to. That is, we started with literacy, even then not with the narrow, but as people got better at it, they naturally evolved. How are we dealing with the whole curriculum? How are we dealing with the deeper, higher order skills, which is really where we're at now to discuss that, and how do we integrate these ideas? And then in the newest stuff is you start to worry about, well, what about the engagement of the students, the well-being of students? It's one thing that you could be high in literacy, but low on student student well-being, let's say, or not strong enough. So I think there's a question of broadening out the measures a little bit, but focus is the place to start. Think evolution, as that is, it's not narrow, it's deep, and you keep going and adding, but you don't do something, say, okay, we did that, now jump over here and do something else.
Okay. Well, so one of your key drivers is that unwavering focus on improving student learning outcomes. I'm interested in because obviously student learning outcomes, the nature of them changes over time. Otherwise, we'd still be doing today what we did 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And that does bring in that question of structured innovation and transformation versus improvement, because for me that's quite a complex domain that I think we are in a domain where we do need to be fundamentally thinking about transformational practice in schools.
Yeah.
And integrated inquiry, but we have a whole stack of baggage from the last 100 years that we also need to work with, and we need to do it in a structured way, using people. So I'm interested in that sort of, you can focus on student learning outcomes, but they may be the wrong ones that you're focusing on. And governments tend to focus, I believe, on the wrong ones, particularly at the moment in terms of national benchmark testing around literacy and numeracy.
Yeah, it's a bit of a complex topic, and I take Ben and myself have the same view, which is that it's not about brand new innovations. It's about deeper implementation and extending that. So that's one way of that's the way we think about it. The Vivian Robinson's research, who I mentioned as well, found that transformational leaders, school principals, had limited impact on student achievement, and those that focused had better impact on this. But let's really be more content oriented here. If you look at, we have 4 levels of measurement in our own system for writing and reading and math, let's say, and if you look at those, levels 1 and 2 is not proficient. Level 3 is proficient. It's quite a high standard. Level 4 is even more so. Levels 3 and 4 are actually the higher order skills.
Okay.
So if you take, and I've just done a book on these. The book is called Stratosphere, which is obviously a highfalutin title, but integrating pedagogy, technology, and change knowledge into the best experience. But if you take the set of skills that are normally called the 21st century learning skills, normally have not gone anywhere for 20 years, that we talked about as in very vague terms. But if you look operationally at what they are now, and you see the domain is familiar now: problem solving, teamwork, citizenship, entrepreneurship, innovation, sustainability. There's about communication. There's about 8 of them. And those are the very ones that we need to focus on now. In our own case in Ontario, we've had about 13% of students at level 4, which is the domain I'm talking about. And that figure hasn't changed in 8 years.
Okay.
It's there. So my theory is, if you do something about it, is that if you have moved a lot of people from level 1 and level 2 to level 3, the next phase should be 3 to 4, as well as keeping backtracking. Okay. So I think that those so-called higher order skills, I don't think there's anything in there you would say is of not lasting value. Okay. If you teach people sustainability and collaboration and citizenship and problem solving and communication, you can't go wrong for the future. I mean, those are the global skills we need.
So we've got a couple of questions from the audience, I think, Michael. One is says, how do you develop professional learning communities in the school day with a very limited budget?
Well, I don't. There's a couple of answers to that. The first answer, I think, is that if something's a priority, you find time to do it. If people say, I can't do physical fitness because I'm too busy. I mean, lots of people, the busiest people in the world are doing physical fitness at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and there's no problem with that. So that's one answer. But the other answer is it's actually easy to do if you put your mind to it. We filmed a school in Canberra. I don't know how to pronounce the name well enough, but it starts with a W and has
lots of Aboriginal letters.
Lots of letters and ends with an A. But they have every week teachers from every team are freed once a week from 11:30 till 3 every week. One day every week, 11:30 till 3, and the principal has just timetabled it with specialist teachers and that, and it was no extra money. So that's one answer. I mean, they're just go and look at schools that are doing it. You'll find some. And then Rick and Becky Dufour, who did the PLC work in the U.S., are big big enterprise professional learning communities. If you go to their website, Professional Learning Communities, they have a section on 101 ways to find time that are actually, they're pulling from the schools they're working with. I think it actually may be 1,001. It's a large number. And you can look in that, you can download that from the website.
Okay.
How do you find time to do this? And they also have a nice, an FAQ section, frequently asked questions.
Yep.
How do I find time? And then they deal with that. So there are some
answers.
Yeah, there are answers, and they're coming from schools that are doing it.
Okay. You're obviously familiar with the work of John Hattie, for example.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I was interested and am interested in is that John says one of the biggest effect sizes is what students walk in the door with. Now he says the effect size is 50% or something.
Yeah.
He sort of implies that there's not much that schools can do about that, but I'm not sure I agree with that. That maybe that by investing other sorts of capital or compensating, like we tend to compensate for low levels of financial capital in families in a variety of ways.
Right.
But I'm interested in your view about, is it possible to compensate for low levels of social capital or cultural capital or intellectual capital in families at the school or system level?
Yeah, John was just here last month and spent a few days with us. I don't think he would quite say it that way, but he does. He's starting with a research finding. One way you could put it is, that's the way it is if you do nothing about it.
Okay.
Right. That's a research finding about a situation that hasn't been attempted to be improved that way. And then you can start pecking away and say, well, let's see if even that's true. Well, why not maximize the other 50%? That would be a start. But there's also the case, we know this, Doug Reeves' work on the 90-90-90 schools, which are schools that are in poverty, high immigration, all that, and 90% of the students are achieving. Schools we could pick out here that we work with, many of them actually, if we went to the Secretariat and said, give us a list of some schools that dramatically overcame the poverty barrier. Schools, I think of, for example, Crosby Heights, which we studied. Ryan Friedman was the principal. They were at about 40%, a large elementary school, 40% proficiency. They really focused, and 3 years later, they were at 84% on their 6 measures. That's the reading, writing, and math, grade 3 and grade 6. So there you have it. I mean, they made up for it, and these students now are doing dramatically better. If we take the high school, and I love Ben's book called More High School Graduates, which OPC also co-publishes, we've gone from 68% graduation to 82% across all 900 schools on the average. So this is we did that by a lot of students that would have dropped out are now not dropping out because of the way we pinpointed help, the way we've used data to identify who they are, the way we changed programs to make programs more attractive to some students that were in danger of dropping out and so on.
So the other thing he says also is that now the principals are 10% of the effect size and teaching quality is 25% or something. And I think you alluded to it before, that fundamental to the improvement of teacher quality is probably the improvement of the quality of leadership in schools. Yeah. And it seems to me that there is a bit of a trend at the moment for principals to become more administrators and managers and less educational leaders. Now, certainly in places like the UK where there are single line budgets, that certainly appears to be the case. And I'm interested about how what would your advice be about how do you hedge against that trend to make principals administrators rather than educational leaders? Well,
let's start with John's findings. First, those findings are, I'm going to say, 15 years old. I mean, he's done his better research over a 10-year period or more. So what they are, the way I want to put it is this. Those are the findings as if you haven't done anything to correct the situation. If you start correcting the situation, you actually will change those findings probably. But let's take the principle because it's an interesting one to talk about. If Ken Leithwood will say as well, the principal is the second most important person. The teacher is the most important. But I can make a case that the teacher is not the most important. Let's take a school that has 20 teachers, and 10 of them could be a lot better than they are. They get a good principal that focuses on pedagogy instruction, and 8 of those 10 improve really dramatically. One principal has improved 8 teachers. One teacher affects 25 kids. Who's more important? You can see on that case that statistically, empirically, the principal is more important. So that's one thing. The second is on your question, there is a bit of a blip now. The major trend in the last 10 years, up until the part you just described, has been the shift from manager to instructional leader. That's the trend in North America for sure, and a trend in Ontario. If it's slipping back now because of managerial concerns, I'm not so sure that that's the, it possibly is the case in the UK, in England at least. And if it is, it's a mistake. And I think what we have to do is get a better handle. I'm just working on something, actually a project with the OPC now, which is called the Principal as Pedagogical Leader. And I want to take the stance that the pedagogical leader is about building the professional capital of the school. Instructional leader is sometimes seen as too narrow to instruction. So even the instructional thing you want to question and say, really, what are we talking about? So we haven't finished that project now, but I'm pretty sure that the notion of principal as building professional capital is going to be the main outcome of that. And if we do, we will have a really powerful role for the principal strengthened. And those so-called research findings that John found in the last 10 years will be different in the next 10 years because the effects will
So we need someone else to do it again, don't we?
Well, yeah.
Well, John may well do it again.
Yeah, well, he's up to 900 now, meta-studies, so I'm sure he'll go for 1,000 and 1,200. But he needs to differentiate pretty soon. His first, he needs to pluck out the last 5 years, let's say, and say, okay, what are the effect sizes here in the last 5 years, instead of just lumping everything together, which he's done very well.
Okay. So in my role as a principal network leader, and trying to work alongside principals around school improvement, what's your advice for me in terms of how, what are the biggest drivers for me, for example, in my practice in order to try and improve school, to facilitate school improvement rather than do it myself? Because I think as bureaucrats or as education leaders, quite often we do fall into the trap of doing the work for people rather than adding to the capacity for them to do it themselves.
And do you mean a principal in a school or a principal as network leader?
No, me as a network leader, working alongside principals, helping them to improve their schools.
Right. Well, I would advise doing it two ways simultaneously. One is, I would call it learning is the work. So that learning is the work means you're helping principals in this case, in their day-to-day work, get better at it. So how would you do that? You would model it. You would enable them to see other, cross-site visit others doing it. You would give them coaching and feedback and those things. And you would literally get them to. And now in Ontario, you can go into almost any school, and not even within a district. I'm just saying you could take 5 different districts and pluck out 5 different principals and ask them to describe their role, and you get a consistent story about I'm shaping the development of teachers, etc. So you need to show people what it looks like, modeling, you need to help them get skilled at it. And we use a lot more video clips, snack films I call them, that are short vignettes. Literacy and Numeracy Secretary, that's a fabulous resource that's free on the website. So you can see leaders in action doing this. So there's that. When everybody around you starts to do it, you really can't you really get a lot of good ideas from it. People need clarity and precision, not just a general statement, you better be a pedagogical leader, which is of no help at all. So I think that's one. And then the second, I call that learning is the work. The second thing, and it depends on the system that you're working in, that we use is I'm going to call it personnel policies to reinforce the direction I just described. Personnel policy would be the job description of the principal. Your job is to focus on student achievement, and your job is at the same time to develop other leaders in the school that can do that. So it's a job description, interview criteria, and interview processes. Mentoring in your first year or two on the job as an administrator. All of those things make a difference. And Helen Timberley, who's one of Vivianne's colleagues in Auckland, also wrote quite a good book recently on the professional learning side. And she says about the principalship, the question is, who is your class? So she said, we know for teachers, your class is these students that are 25 9-year-olds or whatever. But for the principal, in a small school, your class is all the teachers. Principals in a large school, your class is probably the leadership team across the school, the senior leadership team. So I think that's the right way to put it. So we want the role clarity and the getting the better, learning is the work on the job to kind of flourish, and we want to reinforce it with those kinds of personnel policies, and then further reinforce it with, I guess I'll say leadership framework. So, for example, Ontario, we have a very good Ontario Leadership Framework, OLF. You can get it down for the website.
Yeah, good one.
Yeah.
Great.
And so Ken Leithwa has been a major influencer on that. And again, that's one of those non-drivers but strong enablers. So let's say a school district is moving in the direction we're describing, and they're already moving in that direction. They can use the OLF to reinforce the things that I'm talking about and help people focus, but they still have to get the day-to-day learning experiences because you need that day after day development to get good the way we're talking about.
So we've talked about collaborative practice in terms of teachers and schools working, but what about collaborative practice among students and between students and teachers as a driver for school improvement?
Well, it's important. It's the new wave, I guess one could say. It's been bopping around a little bit in the last 5 years in the area of formative assessment. Dylan, William, and many others that write about formative assessment. You'll see as part of the pedagogical solution is that self-evaluation on the part of students, peer evaluation on the part of students working together. So that's already pedagogically speaking showing up in the last 5 years. When you introduce good technology, as I've just been studying, you just accelerate that like crazy, so that now you have students as teachers, because they know more about technology than teachers do. So you can, there's various, there's a phrase that's called flipping the role of students and teachers, not just about that, but there's some major work now, because when the criteria I've offered for this solution, I guess I'll say in the book, that these new innovations have to do 4 things, learning experientially. One is they have to be irresistibly engaging for students, whereas now just the higher the grade, the more boring it gets for students on the average. And secondly, it has to be elegantly easy to use, just like iPad is. You have to figure out the complexity. Thirdly, it has to be engage in technology 24/7, I'm going to say. In other words, the information bank is 24 hours, 7 days a week, all forever. And that has to be part of the pedagogy that's used. And the fourth one, which gets closer to this higher order skills, it needs to be steeped in real life problem solving. And when kids are steeped in real life problem solving along with those other 3, they're running the show, a lot of it. The teacher then, this goes back to John, he has the right finding, if you remember his finding, that was teacher as facilitator had limited impact on students. Teacher as active, I forget what word he used it, but it was the active version of facilitation, designing and helping students get feedback and all of those things, and students feedback each other, orchestrating that. That's where the impact is. So we have a new role for teachers that's going to be very much more interesting for teachers and going to be more powerful with the use of technology. And right now we don't have many good examples of it, but we're entering an improvement cycle because of technology's dominance, even though it hasn't been used the right way. It's just really irresistible now in many ways. You have to take it into account. And I think we'll see a lot more. The biggest move is going to be greater student engagement. And the biggest kind of advantage, to put it crassly, is all of a sudden we've got enormously huge free labor. Namely students. They don't cost a penny. No, they don't. And that they can teach each other. You can do that under the guidance and the coordination of a really good teacher.
So when you talk about technology or digital pedagogy, whatever you want to call this, if as a principal, for example, you believe that there are some non-negotiables around that in classrooms, I'm interested in your view about how do you move a school when some members of the staff, for example, may be adamantly opposed to or think they can't do it, particularly around technology. And I think you're right when you say that we've had the wrong view about it. We've seen it as something with a life of its own rather than an enabler of quality learning. Because it seems to me that there's an enormous amount of professional learning that does need to go on with teachers around how to make the best use of technology. Otherwise it will sit in cupboards and it will waste time. About how is the best way to go about that? Well, in a system and in a school.
It's not a straightforward question in some ways, and we're about to get engaged in Uruguay, which has they have had a policy since 2008 of one computer for every student and one computer for every teacher. And the way they introduced it, they said, that's the words of the project director, we didn't want to complicate the lives of teachers, so we just kind of put it out there and then we have various support structures. So they're using a pull and nudge strategy, not a push strategy.
Yep.
We're going to, I think, evaluate it. It's going to be very interesting. So there you see where the teachers weren't saying everybody has to go to in-service work on technology. They just more naturalistic. He said if we get it out there and
it'll gradually
pull along.
by osmosis.
And then more, and if you get a critical mass, then it will take off the group using the group. So that's one way of putting it. The second way, I think we have to be careful to say that there still will be great teaching practices that don't depend on technology. So it's not like technology is going to be the sole solution. Technology is going to go from, in pedagogical terms, from almost zero use, I'll say, to good use, which might be
like
50, 60%. Like a lot of good use, and so we'll see a dramatic increase. And I think that we, in our change work, you can't make people change, but you can create the conditions that make it more likely for them to change, and that those. We also have in our workshops a very interesting module on I call it the resistance mindset. That basically says that you have to, if you're facing resistance, well, if there's a whole number of people that are resisting, you've got the wrong strategy. But let's say we're talking about a small number of resisting people. Here's the flow for me. You have to respect people before they've earned respect. So if you're a resistor teacher and I'm a principal that wants technology used, I've got to respect you before you're going to give me respect back. That's one thing. Secondly, we say you have to practice impressive empathy. Impressive empathy, we all know what empathy is, but impressive empathy is when you have empathy for someone who's in your way. You wish they would sort of go away, but they're in your way. So that empathy, understanding where they're coming from. Third, we say create the conditions that make, I use it from the 6 secrets that increase the chances that people become more lovable. But actually, I just mean create conditions that they're more successful and they participate. And then when you do those things, you actually preempt a great deal of resistance. And then the fourth one is deal firmly with what's left over, which is really small amount. So when a leader's job is to create the climate that kind of incorporates people and ends up with peers being the most dominant force of incorporation.
So it's a social capital thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
To use that to drive. So the other thing we haven't got much more time really, but the other thing I'm interested in is we obviously have to work with our governments. Politicians and governments have a large part to say. So in Australia, for example, where our federal government is now starting to talk about introducing performance-based pay, which is going to happen. I'm interested, which I think is the likelihood is that that's a very negative thing. It's going to be divisive and cause enormous angst for principals about identifying the 10% of people who are going to get additional pay.
Yeah.
I'm interested about how you would see. Now, how do you manage that as a principal or as a system when you have your political masters are really saying this is what we want you to do?
Well, merit pay has the kind of, I guess I'll say, odd quality that it combines 2 wrong drivers at once, which is external negative accountability and individualism. So it's a double whammy. But I think I would say basically, and I'd say this to all the groups, and you can take it around accountability. You may be stuck with central policymakers' policies, but you're not stuck with their mindset. You can have a different mindset. So merit pay is a little bit of a tough one if it's wrongly used, but let's take negative external accountability. And in Australia with NAPLAN and major consequences from the centre. Just because the federal level is doing that doesn't mean if I'm a director of a school district, a Catholic school district, or I'm a head of ACT, which Jim was, it doesn't mean that I have to have their mindset. I can have a non-judgmental growth mindset to the same policy that they have up here, and I can make that clear to the people that I work with. That's the way I'm leading. And so I think we need people not to say, how do I implement the federal policy? Not to say, how do I avoid completely dealing with it, but how do I exploit it in a way that makes sense to our people to get something done that's of value to our community and will pay off that way. So the distinction is policy is one thing, mindset's another, and you can differentiate if you're honest.
Between the two. But it is a difficult boat to ride sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, but you don't want to be in the position where 90% of your energy as a leader is complaining about federal policy.
No, well, it's just wasted. It's wasted energy. Isn't it?
I mean, if it's that high. There's one other thing I wanted to say about social capital, which is I think, really key in our book, which is it's easier to go from social capital to human capital than the other way around. So I just want to explain what we meant by that. If let's say you're a principal who has great human capital, and you go into a negative culture, that human capital that you have as leader, and you've got the authority of the leadership, you can change that school, but it's a hell of an uphill battle, and you might get burnt out, or you might get run out if you do it the wrong way or too early. So that's one way. If you flip it around and say we've got a school that has high social capital, and a teacher goes in there with low human capital, that teacher will have a hard time staying there and not improving. So in this, Carrie Liana, you mentioned, University of Pittsburgh, has shown this social capital is more powerful than human capital. Obviously, you want both, but we're putting our money that social capital will leverage human capital a lot faster, and then use the personnel policies to reinforce the human capital, but use the day-to-day culture to drive the social capital, which in fact will produce more individual capital at the same time. And this is really this story of success of the Shanghai, of things that we've done in the last 8 years here.
When I was talking to David Hargraves at Cambridge a couple of weeks ago, he introduced a concept of cultural capital, which was a concept I really hadn't heard very much about before. And I'm still trying to know where do all these things fit, because you can probably put them in lots of boxes. Now you could put it in human capital or intellectual capital or social capital, but how different are these things?
Well, we had at one point in the draft we had cultural capital in our book, and the capital that's in the community, let's say, and that you would develop. We basically decided, well, by the time we're finished, we'll have erotic capital and every other thing in there. So we've got to draw the line somewhere. What's the essence of this? And those three, the professional capital, that's three subparts: human capital, social capital, and we haven't talked about decisional capital,
which is interesting.
But every profession that's worth its worth its salt works in teams, and the team has great decisional capital when they face difficult problems like recalcitrant students or whatever, where there's no kind of cookbook answer to it. They figure it out because they've got that combination of three capitals. So I think social capital is relevant as a category, and but I'm wanting to draw the line in terms of what the community, what the school is doing. You could make the case, it is within our book actually to do this, that a principal who's building capital is building the professional capital inside the school and building the relationships with the community at the same time, and that community building relationship is cultural capital development actually. So I think, but as I said, you could always add things, and I think this is kind of a case of we want to get the essence of the profession. That's where we're starting. If people can add to that, then that's fine. But it will dilute, I think, the concentration that we're able to bring to bear in this book.
So do you think the definition of, the definition of social capital is changing? Because when James Coleman first started to talk about it in the 80s and early 90s, he was based that around the Catholic school system, for example. So social capital was seen as something belonging to the culture of the church or what students brought in as a religious background, for example. So it belonged to something which we're not talking about any. I think we're talking about a different form of social capital to that, aren't we now? And then when business companies started to report on social outcomes, which was a form of social capital in the business world, then that's another different form, isn't it? And
well, it is, but there's an easy explanation. Because the word social capital means any group can be thought to have social capital. So we can take a street gang, say they have fabulous social capital. So that applies everywhere. Remember, though, we're applying it within professional capital. So it's not social capital, any old social capital. It's the social capital that teachers have, and that's what defines it inside the profession, and that makes it more pure. So that we want professional social capital, to use a bit of a way of saying it, and to build up professional social capital will be the most powerful thing you can do. And therefore, it's not in danger of being confused with other kinds of social capital, because we've already said it's only about the teaching profession and the leaders within the educational system. It's not about the whole world.
So if you do take a bit of a picture about beyond the teaching profession as looking after kids, and let's take the street gang stuff. who do have very high levels of social capital,
right.
but we probably don't lever that very well in schools, do we? Because that sort of social capital it's anti in lots of ways the middle class environment of schools. So I'm interested about whether you think if you take capital as something you can earn, you can invest, and you can spend. How do we go about, for example, the high levels of social capital that street gangs may well have, as something which they can spend or transform into human or intellectual capital in schools? Is that possible or not?
Well, I think it's the right question. I'm not sure you would literally transfer it in, but one of the books we use in our own book is on by a person who studied. Basically, it's the book that says peers can save the world, and she gives example after example of positive peer pressure. So one was about smoking in North Carolina, another was about overthrowing a government in Eastern Europe, and these were peers that were using each other as a peer group and building up and taking the chances and supporting each other and actually causing social change from almost hopeless positions to start with to actual success. So basically what she said is what you just said. Instead of thinking of gangs of negative social capital, let's think of peers as positive social capital. What would it look like? How could you get more of it? So that's the line of thought that will pay off.
Okay. I'm not sure how much longer we've got, about 2 minutes, I think. So I suppose in the last 2 minutes, I'd really know, what's that piece of fundamental advice that you're going to give me that I'll take with me? I think there's been some fantastic stuff we've talked about.
The reason that social capital is timely now, I would say, is 2 reasons. One is it is about the profession. So that really is, it links it into the profession very squarely. And secondly, it takes the narrow definition of professional learning communities and makes it much more fundamental in the whole system, the entire teaching profession, all the schools, all the subgroups. So I think what we've done is make social capital more associated with whole system reform, more associated with the profession as a core group leading the transformation or development of the system, with leadership at all levels, teacher leaders, school leaders, district leaders, state leaders. And so it makes a nice kind of focus for this whole system reform that more and more people are looking seriously at now that they see some countries have actually done it. It's possible, and people are political leaders. We're finding more and more are gravitating towards discussions that said, well, how do we do this? We know it can be done here and there. Well, how do we do it? So they're asking the right questions now. How do we incorporate capacity building? How do we incorporate developing the teaching profession? How do we develop leaders at all levels of the system? That's the agenda discussion now, and with more and more, even politicians, I'll say.
Yeah, so it's an interesting domain of practice, isn't it? Because in lots of ways it goes back to some of that stuff from Vygotsky, right back in about the social nature of learning. And if we fundamentally believe, and I think some of those practices are now being revisited, and I think that if you fundamentally believe that learning is a social practice, then obviously the learning between teachers and between organisations and systems is also a social practice. So
it is, and I would only say about that is we always want to be crystal clear, precise, and specific about what we're talking about when we use that. Because the phrases of social learning and professional learning communities are too vague for most people. And we need to really pin them down so that people can see what they look like. So a lot of our success is about identifying with precision what exactly it is we're talking about and why it gets results. Not that we say you have to imitate this, but we basically say at least you know what it looks like.
So we know what we're talking about.
So you can agree or disagree. You can move towards it, and most people do move towards these things because they work.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Michael. It's been a wonderful hour. Thank you very much.
Yeah, went by
It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure, too.
Thank you.